One afternoon in late February of 2023, a 26-year-old man named Julio Berjo walked toward a public park in the high-altitude city of Puno, Peru. Puno is a beautiful but incredibly harsh place located way up in the Andes Mountains, right next to the freezing waters of Lake Titicaca. The air up there is very thin, making every breath feel heavy, and the streets are steep and winding, filled with a mixture of modern concrete buildings and ancient stone ruins left behind by the Incan civilization hundreds of years ago. On this particular afternoon, the cold mountain wind was blowing off the lake, but Julio barely noticed it. He was walking with his girlfriend, Juanita. They were on their way to the park to meet up with Julio's two best friends. Now, this meeting was actually a really big deal because even though Julio and Juanita had been together for quite some time, Julio had never actually introduced her to his friends. In fact, Julio had always been incredibly hesitant to bring Juanita around his friend group. He was a young man who cared deeply about what other people thought of him, and he was very insecure about his relationship. The truth was, Juanita was just a little bit different from your average person. She was extremely quiet, she never spoke, she did not move on her own, and she required a lot of specialized attention. Julio knew that his friends might pick up on her unusual nature and perhaps make fun of him for it, or at the very least, it would cause a lot of awkwardness. So for a long time, Julio simply kept her a secret, living his life with her behind closed doors and avoiding any situation where his social circles might overlap with his domestic life. But the problem was that Julio's friends knew he had a girlfriend. He had talked about her, and he had even told them her name was Juanita. Over the months, they kept pressuring him, asking why they had never met her, and demanding that he finally bring her out so they could all hang out together. Eventually, Julio realized he could not keep making up excuses forever. He decided that the best way to handle this was to schedule a casual meetup at a local park. He figured that if they were in a public, open-air setting, it would keep things relaxed. And to make absolutely sure that the meeting went as smoothly as possible, Julio decided to bring along some refreshments. He grabbed a large, heavy, red insulated delivery cooler, the kind that delivery drivers use to transport food, and he packed it with bottles of rum, cans of soda, plastic cups, and a bag of ice. Julio's plan was simple. They would sit down, have some drinks, chat, and finally get the introduction over with. But there was a major catch to this plan. In Peru, it is strictly illegal to consume alcohol in public spaces like parks, and the local police are known to actively patrol these areas and hand out hefty citations to anyone caught breaking the law. Julio was well aware of this risk, but his anxiety about the introduction was so high that he decided the potential legal trouble was worth it if the alcohol helped break the ice and make his friends accept Juanita. So, Julio lugged this heavy red cooler through the steep cobblestone street, carrying the weight of the drinks, the ice, and his silent girlfriend Juanita all the way to the park. As he reached the edge of the grassy field, he spotted his two best friends waiting for him. They were sitting on a crumbling, ancient stone wall that jutted out of the ground. In Puno, these Incan ruins are so common that locals often do not even pay attention to them. They are just treated like ordinary park benches or elements of the landscape. Julio's friends were sitting there, chatting, completely unaware of what Julio was bringing with him in his large red bag. Julio walked up to the wall, set the heavy red cooler down on the grass, and greeted his friends. His friends looked up, smiling, eager to finally meet the mysterious Juanita. Julio, trying to read their faces and gauge their initial reactions, immediately began opening the cooler to get the drinks ready. He pulled out the bottles of rum, the sodas, and the cups and started pouring generous drinks for everyone. Within a few minutes, all three men were sitting on the stone wall, laughing and talking, and Julio felt a massive wave of relief wash over him. He realized he had been worrying about absolutely nothing. His friends were being incredibly nice, they were enjoying the drinks, and they seemed completely fine with Juanita, even though she was just as quiet and unusual as he had feared. For a while, the group sat there, enjoying the afternoon sun and getting increasingly loud and relaxed as the rum began to take effect. Julio was incredibly happy. He felt like he had successfully navigated a major hurdle in his social life. But then, right in the middle of a conversation, Julio noticed a sudden change in his friends' behavior. They both froze, their smiles disappearing, and their faces turning completely pale. They were staring at something directly behind Julio, and one of them let out a sharp gasp. Julio's stomach instantly dropped. His mind went straight to the worst-case scenario. He assumed that a police patrol had spotted them drinking in public and was about to arrest them all. He turned around slowly, and sure enough, his fears were confirmed. Two police officers were walking directly toward them across the grass. Julio's friends began to panic, hurriedly putting their plastic cups down on the grass and trying to look casual, but it was far too late. The officers had already seen the open cooler, the bottles of alcohol, and the cups. Julio resigned himself to his fate, expecting a steep fine or a trip to the local police station for public intoxication. The officers walked up to the group, looking sternly at the open containers of alcohol. But as they got closer, one of the officers leaned over and looked directly into the large red delivery cooler that Julio had been carrying. The officer expected to see more bottles of alcohol or ice. But instead, when he looked inside, he froze. His eyes went wide, and he immediately took several steps back, placing his hand on his holster and shouting at Julio to stay exactly where he was. It turned out that Julio was right to be worried about how his friends in the public would react to Juanita, because she was indeed very different from your average girlfriend. Juanita was not a living human being at all. She was an 800-year-old mummified pre-Hispanic man from the ancient Incan era. Julio's father had actually acquired this mummy decades ago, long before Julio was even born. The mummy had been a permanent fixture in Julio's family home for his entire life, kept inside a private room where Julio would see it every single day. Over the years, as Julio grew up, he developed a deeply unusual, highly intense psychological attachment to this mummy. He began talking to the mummy, treating it not as an ancient archaeological artifact, but as a living, breathing companion. Eventually, he convinced himself that they were in a committed, loving, romantic relationship. Julio called the mummy Juanita, believing it was the spirit of a woman, and he genuinely believed that she communicated with him in her own silent way. He would tell people that Juanita held his hand when he was lonely, and that if he ever misbehaved or had bad thoughts, her spirit would reach out and gently poke his feet at night to keep him in line. Julio's friends had heard him talk about Juanita for years, but they had always assumed it was a running joke or a bizarre, eccentric bit of humor. They never imagined that Julio was entirely serious, nor did they expect that when they pressured him to bring his girlfriend to the park, he would actually pack an 800-year-old corpse into a delivery cooler and carry it across town. When the police officers looked into that red cooler, they saw the skeletal, leathery remains of the mummy curled up in a fetal position, wrapped in ancient textiles, sitting right next to the bottles of rum and melting ice. Julio was immediately arrested and taken into custody, not for public drinking, but for the illegal possession and transport of a protected national cultural heritage item. The mummy, which had been the center of Julio's emotional life for so long, was confiscated by the Peruvian Ministry of Culture for scientific research and preservation. During their analysis, the researchers made a shocking discovery. Juanita was not a female at all. The skeletal structure and pelvic dimensions revealed that the mummy was actually a mature male, likely around 45 years old at the time of death, dating back to a period between 600 and 800 years ago. This meant that Julio's entire romantic fantasy was built on a complete misunderstanding of the artifact's true nature. While his friends were left in absolute shock, Julio was left facing serious legal charges, and his beloved Juanita was locked away in a secure government archive, separating them forever. His desperate attempt to fit in and look normal to his friends had completely shattered his life. Sometimes the desire to show off and create a perfect appearance doesn't just ruin a relationship. It can unleash a slow, invisible horror that devastates innocent families, while the people responsible remain completely blind to the damage they have caused. To see how this can happen, we have to travel back to the mid-1980s to a brand new, highly sought-after high-rise apartment building in the city of Kramatorsk, Ukraine. During this era, the Soviet Union was locked in a fierce ideological battle with the West, and they were incredibly eager to show the world that their society was prosperous, modern, and technologically superior. With the Moscow Olympics having taken place just a few years earlier in 1980, the government had gone on a massive construction spree, building state-of-the-art apartment complexes designed to showcase the pinnacle of Soviet engineering. These buildings were constructed with thick, high-quality concrete walls, beautiful modern finishes, and excellent soundproofing. For ordinary citizens who were used to living in cramped, noisy, outdated communal housing, getting an apartment in one of these new buildings was considered an absolute dream. A hardworking family man named Dmitry had been waiting on the housing list for years, hoping for a miracle. He had a wife and two young, active teenage sons, and they had spent their entire lives living in subpar conditions. So, in 1984, when Dmitry received an official notification that a highly desirable unit, Unit 85, had suddenly become available, he felt like the luckiest man alive. He immediately accepted the offer, and within days, the family packed up all of their earthly possessions into cardboard boxes to move into their new home. The move-in day was filled with excitement and physical labor. Dmitry, his wife, and his sons spent the entire afternoon hauling heavy wooden furniture, mattresses, and boxes up the stairs and down the pristine, quiet hallways of the modern building. Dmitry was filled with pride, feeling that he had finally succeeded in providing a safe, beautiful, and prestigious home for his family. But as he was carrying one of the very last cardboard boxes down the hallway toward Unit 85, he had an encounter that struck him as incredibly strange. The door to a neighboring apartment slowly opened, and a woman stepped out into the hallway. Dmitry stopped, intending to smile and introduce himself as their new neighbor. But when he looked at the woman's face, his smile faded. She looked shockingly gaunt, thin, and pale. She had deep, dark, heavy bags under her eyes, and she looked completely exhausted, as if life had beaten her down to the absolute limit. But what disturbed Dmitri the most was the expression on her face. She was staring at him with a look of profound, silent pity. Before Dmitri could say a word, the woman abruptly stepped back into her apartment and clicked the door shut behind her. Dmitri stood there in the silent hallway for a moment, wondering if he should knock on her door and ask if she was okay. He was naturally a quiet, introverted man who preferred to mind his own business, so he ultimately decided to let it go, assuming she was just tired or going through a difficult personal matter. He walked the rest of the way to Unit 85, carried the box into his son's bedroom, and watched with a smile as his boys began decorating. To make the room feel cozy, the boys stood up on their mattresses and hung a large, heavy, decorative woolen rug on the concrete wall directly behind their beds. Dmitri felt a deep sense of satisfaction, believing this was the beginning of an amazing new chapter for his family. However, as the months went by, Dmitri began to notice a strange, unsettling atmosphere that seemed to hang over the entire building. Despite the beautiful architecture and modern amenities, the residents were shockingly unfriendly. Every neighbor he passed in the hallways was quiet, sullen, and appeared completely devoid of energy. Furthermore, the building was always eerily silent. Even with the advanced soundproofing, there was an unnatural lack of life, as if a heavy blanket of gloom had settled over the entire complex. Dmitri tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on his work and his family, but a couple of years after they moved in, tragedy struck. Dmitri's older son, who had always been an incredibly healthy, active, and athletic boy, began to complain of constant, overwhelming fatigue. He lost his appetite, his skin turned a sickly, pale color, and he could barely find the energy to get out of bed in the morning. At first, Dmitri and his wife assumed their son was just experiencing the typical stresses of being a teenager, or perhaps he was coming down with a bad flu. But the boy's condition continued to rapidly deteriorate. Deeply concerned, they took him to a specialist for a series of medical tests. A few days later, the doctor called them back in with devastating news. Their son had developed leukemia, a serious and life-threatening cancer of the blood. The family was completely shattered by the diagnosis. They could not understand how their vibrant, healthy boy could suddenly become so gravely ill. The older son was immediately placed on aggressive cancer treatments, which required him to spend almost all of his time resting in his bedroom, leaning directly against the wall where the decorative rug hung, but the nightmare was only beginning. Just a few months later, Dmitri's younger son began exhibiting the exact same symptoms. He became incredibly weak, pale, and constantly exhausted. Terrified, Dmitri rushed him to the hospital for immediate blood work. As they sat in the cold clinic room waiting for the results, Dmitri prayed that it was just a coincidence, perhaps a simple infection. But when the doctor entered the room with a grim expression, Dmitri knew his worst fears had come true. The younger son also had leukemia. Dmitri was in complete disbelief. He grabbed the doctor's arm and demanded to know how it was mathematically or medically possible for two healthy young brothers to develop the exact same rare blood cancer within months of each other. The doctor looked at him with sympathy and explained that there was only one logical explanation: genetics. The doctor asserted that Dmitri and his wife must carry a rare, hereditary genetic mutation that predisposed their children to leukemia, and that this genetic curse had unfortunately skipped generations only to strike both of his sons at the same time. Dmitri brought his younger son home, completely crushed by a wave of agonizing guilt. He believed that his own bad genes had poisoned his children, and that his desire to give them a better life had been overshadowed by a genetic flaw he had passed down to them. After tucking both of his sick boys into their beds, Dmitri went outside to take a walk in the cold air, desperately trying to clear his head and process the horror that had consumed his family. When he returned to the apartment building, he saw the pale, gaunt neighbor woman sitting on the concrete steps smoking a cigarette in the dark. As Dmitri walked past her, she looked up and asked him if everything was okay. Overwhelmed by grief, Dmitri stopped and found himself pouring his heart out to this stranger. He told her about both of his sons being diagnosed with leukemia and how the doctor had explained that it was a tragic, genetic coincidence. The neighbor listened silently, but she did not look surprised at all. She did not ask any questions, nor did she offer words of comfort. Instead, she slowly exhaled a cloud of smoke, nodded her head, and asked Dmitri a single question. She asked him if he knew anything about the people who had lived in Unit 85 before his family moved in. Dmitri shook his head, saying he knew nothing other than the fact that the unit had suddenly become available. The woman looked at him with deep sadness and revealed the terrifying truth. She told him that the previous tenants were a healthy mother and her two young children. Within less than 2 years of moving into Unit 85, all three of them had developed severe cases of leukemia and died. That was the sole reason the apartment had suddenly opened up for Dmitri's family. This revelation hit Dmitry like a physical blow. He realized instantly that two entirely unrelated families developing the exact same fatal blood cancer in the exact same apartment could not possibly be a genetic coincidence. There had to be something physical, something invisible and deadly, hidden inside the walls of Unit 85 that was actively poisoning anyone who slept there. Dmitry became completely obsessed with finding the source of the poison. Over the next year, he waged a desperate, frantic battle against the Soviet bureaucracy. He contacted building managers, health inspectors, and local housing officials, begging them to send someone to test his apartment for gas leaks, toxic mold, or chemical contamination in the water and soil. But the officials were cold, dismissive, and defensive. They insisted that the building was a shining jewel of modern Soviet engineering and that everything was perfectly safe. They accused Dmitry of spreading hysterical, unscientific rumors to cover up his family's genetic misfortune, and they eventually began flat-out ignoring his letters and phone calls. Tragically, the delays were fatal. In 1987, Dmitry's older son passed away from the illness. The younger son continued to grow weaker, his body slowly succumbing to the same disease. Meanwhile, a dark rumor began to whisper through the hallways of the complex. People started openly saying that Unit 85 was cursed, a place of death that consumed anyone who crossed its threshold. On a freezing morning in 1989, Dmitry returned to the quiet, empty apartment from the hospital, where his younger son was now in critical condition. Dmitry and his wife were spending virtually all of their time at the hospital, and Dmitry had only returned to grab some clean clothes. The silence in the apartment was deafening, a physical weight that pressed down on his chest. Instead of immediately leaving, Dmitry slowly walked into his son's bedroom and sat down on the empty mattress. He stared at the large, decorative woolen rug that his boys had hung on the concrete wall 5 years earlier, remembering the joy and hope they had felt on their very first day in the apartment. As he stared at the rug, his eyes caught on a strange physical defect near the center of the fabric. He stood up and walked over to get a closer look. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. There was a distinct, localized circular burn mark on the woolen rug, as if the fabric had been subjected to intense, concentrated heat over a long period. But there were no electrical outlets, heaters, or light fixtures anywhere near that part of the wall. Dmitry reached out and touched the scorched area of the rug. It felt dry and brittle. He pulled the heavy rug away from the wall and gasped. The concrete surface directly behind the burn mark was discolored, cracked, and gave off a faint, inexplicable warmth. Realizing that this was the exact spot where his sons had rested their heads while sleeping for the past 5 years, Dmitry ran out of the room, grabbed the telephone, and called emergency services, screaming that there was something hazardous inside his wall. This time, because of the physical evidence of damage to the wall and the history of deaths, the authorities sent a team of specialized inspectors equipped with radiation detectors. As the inspectors entered the hallway of the apartment building, their Geiger counters began to emit a low, steady clicking sound. But when they walked into the bedroom of Unit 85 and approached the cracked concrete wall, the machines began to scream frantically, indicating off-the-charts, lethal levels of radiation. The inspectors immediately ordered an evacuation of the entire building. Workers wearing heavy protective suits used industrial tools to cut into the thick concrete panel of the wall. Embedded deep inside the solid stone, they found a tiny, highly radioactive metal capsule containing cesium-137. The investigation eventually reconstructed the horrifying chain of events that had led to this disaster. Back in the late 1970s, a construction crew was working at a quarry, extracting the gravel and stone that would be used to manufacture the precast concrete panels for the new Olympic housing projects. To measure the density of the soil and stone, the engineers used a specialized industrial gauge. This gauge contained a small, highly radioactive capsule of cesium-137. At some point during the hectic, rushed schedule, the capsule accidentally detached from the machine and fell into the massive piles of harvested gravel. The workers realized the capsule was missing, and they initially halted operations to search for it. But when a week passed without success, the government officials overseeing the project grew furious. They were under immense pressure from the highest levels of the Soviet government to complete the prestigious apartment buildings in time for the Moscow Olympics, and they refused to allow any further delays. The supervisors made a calculated, criminal decision. They ordered the search to be called off, assuming the tiny capsule was buried harmlessly deep in the quarry. They resumed operations, and the gravel containing the lost radioactive capsule was scooped up, mixed into a batch of liquid concrete, and poured into a mold to create a wall panel. That specific panel was transported to Kramatorsk and erected as the bedroom wall of Unit 85. For nearly a decade, the unsuspecting families who lived in Unit 85 were subjected to a constant, silent, invisible bombardment of lethal gamma radiation, equivalent to receiving thousands of chest X-rays every single year. The radiation slowly destroyed their immune systems and mutated their blood cells, causing the rapid onset of fatal leukemia. In total, 6 people who lived in that building died from radiation exposure, and 17 more were left permanently disabled with severe chronic illnesses. Despite the clear, documented negligence of the state-run construction company and the officials who ordered the search to be abandoned, the Soviet government quietly hushed up the incident. The capsule was removed, the apartment was sealed, but absolutely no one was ever arrested, prosecuted, or held legally accountable for the tragedy. Dmitri's desperate battle for the truth had finally been won, but it had cost him the lives of his children, all because of a government's desperate rush to make itself look successful to the outside world. While some cover-ups are driven by powerful state institutions seeking to protect national prestige, others are born from the petty, wounded pride of a single individual. Our final story takes us even further back in time to the late 19th century in the state of Illinois, where a detective's obsession with saving his own reputation led him to orchestrate an incredibly elaborate, bizarre hoax that would ultimately secure his permanent public ruin. In the year 1896, the city of Evanston, Illinois, was a rapidly growing suburb located just north of Chicago. The local police department was headed by a proud, highly status-conscious investigator named Detective John White. Detective White was a man who cared deeply about his public image. He dressed immaculately, carried himself with an air of absolute authority, and desperately wanted the local community and his fellow officers to view him as a brilliant master sleuth. But just a week prior to the events of this story, Detective White's carefully constructed reputation had been completely shattered. A sharp, cynical investigative reporter working for the prominent newspaper, the Chicago Chronicle, had published a highly detailed, devastating front-page article about one of White's recent cases. The article exposed how Detective White had completely bungled a high-profile investigation through sheer incompetence and laziness, allowing a major suspect to slip right through his fingers. Almost overnight, White went from being a respected investigator to the laughingstock of the entire Chicago area. His colleagues whispered behind his back, his superiors openly questioned his competence, and the public looked at him with mockery. Detective White was consumed by a toxic mixture of intense embarrassment and burning rage. He became absolutely obsessed with finding a way to salvage his career, redeem his name, and, most importantly, get revenge on the reporter who had humiliated him. The perfect opportunity seemed to present itself on the morning of September 17, 1896. A local homeowner walked into the Evanston police station and reported that while digging a drainage trench in his front yard, he had uncovered a strange cache of old, weathered bones buried deep in the soil. Detective White was assigned to go out and inspect the property. When he first arrived at the home and looked at the bones the homeowner had pulled from the trench, White's professional experience told him right away that they were not human. They were large, thick, and clearly belonged to some kind of farm animal, likely a horse or a deer that had died and been buried on the property decades earlier. Normally, an officer would have simply told the homeowner to discard the animal bones and close the case. But as Detective White stood in the muddy yard staring at the bones, a wild, ambitious plan began to form in his mind. He realized that this specific property was located only a quarter of a mile from the former estate of H.H. Holmes. To the public of 1896, the name H.H. Holmes was synonymous with pure, unimaginable evil. Holmes was America's first widely publicized serial killer, having constructed an elaborate murder castle in Chicago equipped with trapdoors, gas chambers, and basement crematoriums. He had been captured in 1894 and executed by hanging just a few months earlier, in May of 1896. Holmes had officially confessed to 27 horrific murders, but the police and the public widely believed that his true victim count was in the dozens, or perhaps even the hundreds, and that many of his victims' bodies remained hidden and undiscovered throughout the surrounding Chicago suburbs. White realized that if a human skeleton were suddenly discovered so close to Holmes's former residence, the media would immediately erupt into a frenzy. The discovery would be hailed as a historic breakthrough, the solving of a dark, unsolved mystery. And as the lead detective on the case, John White would be catapulted to national fame as a brilliant investigator, completely erasing the stain of his previous failure. But there was one major problem. The bones in the yard were just animal bones. To overcome this obstacle, Detective White decided to orchestrate a highly illegal and incredibly risky deception. Using his official position and access to police resources, White secretly obtained a real, intact human skull. Historical accounts suggest he may have taken the skull from a cold case evidence locker or purchased an anatomical specimen used for medical training. Under the cover of darkness, White crept onto the homeowner's property, knelt in the muddy trench, and carefully buried the human skull deep in the dirt, right alongside the old horse bones. The next morning, White organized a highly publicized, formal excavation of the yard. He brought along several junior officers, shovels, and made sure to generate enough noise and activity to draw a crowd of curious onlookers. With the crowd watching, Detective White climbed down into the trench and began digging with a shovel. At some point, his shovel struck something hard in the soil. White stopped, dropped to his knees, and began carefully brushing away the wet dirt with his bare hands, acting out a performance of intense focus and dramatic suspense. Slowly, he revealed the smooth, rounded surface of a human skull. The crowd gasped as White carefully lifted the skull from the earth, holding it up like a historic treasure. To White's internal delight, the skull was in remarkably good physical condition, with very little decay or discoloration. This was perfect, because it suggested the head had only been buried for a few years, matching the timeline of H.H. Holmes's active killing spree. White acted deeply solemn, wrapping the skull in a protective wool blanket and telling the gathered crowd that they had just uncovered a dark secret. He carried the wrapped skull back to the police station, walking with a deliberate, triumphant stride. When he opened the heavy doors of the station and stepped inside, he saw exactly what he had been hoping for. Sitting at a desk in the center of the main room, interviewing another officer, was the very same reporter from the Chicago Chronicle who had written the article that ruined his reputation. White walked slowly down the center aisle of the room, holding the blanket-wrapped object conspicuously in his arms, making sure to catch the reporter's eye. The reporter stopped what he was doing, looked at White, and asked him what he was carrying. With a smug, triumphant grin, Detective White stopped, looked directly at the reporter, and slowly unfurled the blanket, revealing the human skull. He proudly announced that he had just conducted a brilliant excavation of a property near H.H. Holmes's former home and discovered the buried remains of an entirely new, unsuspected murder victim. He suggested to the reporter that this was the scoop of a lifetime, a historic discovery that would make front-page news across the country. The reporter was visibly stunned. He immediately grabbed his notepad and began asking White a flurry of urgent questions. White happily fed him details, embellishing the story of how his physical and mental investigative instincts had led him to suspect the property and discover the hidden grave. The reporter thanked White profusely for the exclusive scoop and rushed out of the station to file his article. White watched him leave, feeling an incredible sense of vindication. His plan had worked beautifully. The very reporter who had tried to destroy his career was now going to write a massive front-page story hailing him as a heroic detective. The next morning, when Detective White walked into the police station, he was greeted by a standing ovation from his fellow officers. They cheered, clapped, and slapped him on the back, congratulating him on the monumental find. The morning edition of the Chicago Chronicle had just hit the stands, and the front page featured a massive, sensational headline about White's discovery of the skull. To White's absolute delight, the reporter had gone even further than expected, openly speculating that the skull belonged to Minnie Williams, the beautiful former wife of H.H. Holmes, who had mysteriously vanished shortly after their wedding and whose body had never been found. The article painted Detective White as a brilliant, dedicated lawman who had finally brought closure to a tragic mystery. White spent the entire day basked in glory, enjoying the absolute peak of his professional life. But his triumph would prove to be incredibly short-lived. What Detective White had drastically underestimated was the thoroughness and professional skepticism of the reporter. While the reporter had been eager to publish the initial breaking news to scoop his competitors, he did not simply take White's word as absolute truth. After filing the morning story, the reporter decided to follow up by visiting the county medical examiner, who had been tasked with conducting a formal forensic analysis of the skull and the other bones found in the yard. When the reporter arrived at the morgue, the medical examiner threw cold water on the entire discovery. He informed the reporter that the other bones found on the property were indisputably from a horse, not a human. But the real bombshell came when the medical examiner turned his attention to the skull itself. He pointed out to the reporter that the skull showed clear, unmistakable physical evidence of having been professionally cleaned, bleached, and polished. It possessed tiny, precise metal hooks and drill holes near the jawline, which were used to mount skulls in medical classrooms and anatomical displays. Furthermore, the skull showed absolutely no signs of soil staining or natural decomposition that would occur from being buried in wet Illinois dirt for several years. The medical examiner concluded that the skull had never been part of a buried murder victim. It was a common medical specimen that had been placed in the dirt very recently, likely within the past 24 hours. The reporter immediately realized that he had been set up. He saw through Detective White's entire scheme, realizing that the desperate officer had deliberately planted a classroom skull in a pile of old horse bones to orchestrate a fake discovery, humiliate the newspaper, and artificially save his own failing career. The reporter was furious at being tricked, but he also realized he had an even bigger, more sensational story on his hands. He rushed back to the newspaper offices, wrote a scathing, detailed expose, and rushed it to the printing presses for a special evening edition of the Chicago Chronicle. On his way home from work that night, still riding the high of his morning success, Detective White stopped at a crowded newsstand in the center of town to pick up a copy of the evening paper. He handed a coin to the vendor, grabbed the newspaper, and looked at the front page. His heart stopped, and the blood drained from his face. Instead of a continuation of his praise, the front page headline exposed Detective White's entire hoax in brutal, humiliating detail. The article revealed that the brilliant detective had tampered with a crime scene, planted a polished medical school skull in a pile of horse bones, and lied to the public in a desperate, pathetic attempt to cover up his own incompetence. As White stood frozen on the street corner, reading the words of his own ruin, he began to hear a low, rumbling noise coming from the people standing all around him. He looked up and saw that the other customers at the newsstand, who had also just purchased the evening paper, were looking directly at him. They were pointing, whispering, and then they began to laugh. The sound of their mocking laughter echoed down the street, cementing Detective White's permanent public disgrace. He was immediately fired from the police force, his career was utterly destroyed, and he spent the rest of his life living in obscurity, a victim of his own desperate attempt to make himself look good. Now let us examine the true depth of the tragedy that connects all three of these stories. In each case, we see individuals who are completely consumed by the desire to project an image of success, happiness, or competence to the outside world. Julio Berrio wanted so badly to appear like a normal young man with a loving, devoted girlfriend that he went to the extreme length of transporting a fragile 800-year-old mummified corpse across town in a delivery bag, completely blind to the absolute bizarre and illegal nature of his actions. To him, the illusion of his relationship was more important than the reality of the artifact he was desecrating. In Kramatorsk, the Soviet authorities were so desperate to show off their modern, prosperous communist society to the international visitors of the Moscow Olympics that they willingly cut corners on public safety. They ignored the loss of a highly dangerous radioactive industrial capsule, choosing instead to rush the construction of residential apartment blocks rather than admit to a mistake. Their need to look good on the world stage resulted in the slow, agonizing deaths of multiple families who simply wanted a safe place to live. Dmitry and his family paid the ultimate price for a government's state-sponsored vanity. And finally, Detective John White was so consumed by his own wounded pride and his burning desire to humiliate a local reporter that he destroyed the very career he was trying to save. He planted evidence, fabricated a historic discovery, and lied to his entire department, believing he was smart enough to pull off the perfect deception. But in the end, his elaborate plan collapsed under the weight of basic scientific facts, leaving him with nothing but a ruined reputation and a lifetime of public mockery. These cases serve as a chilling reminder of what happens when we prioritize appearance over substance, and when we value the perception of others more than the truth itself. The consequences of our actions have a way of catching up to us, and the very things we hide or manipulate will eventually come to light, destroying the elaborate illusions we have built. Whether it is a mummy in a red cooler, a radioactive capsule hidden inside a concrete wall, or a medical skull buried in a pile of horse bones, the truth always has a way of revealing itself, often in the most devastating ways possible. As we look back at the lives that were shattered by these events, we are left with a haunting sense of what could have been. If Julio had simply respected the historical significance of the artifact in his home, if the Soviet supervisors had prioritized human lives over political deadlines, and if Detective White had focused on doing his job with integrity rather than seeking personal revenge, these tragedies could have been entirely avoided. But instead, they chose the path of deception and vanity, leaving behind a trail of grief, ruined careers, and unanswered questions that still echo through history. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.